We usually view history as a logical chain of human decisions, but occasionally the timeline behaves more like a glitching system. It throws up anomalies that look less like a steady march of progress and more like a repeated, fractured loop. In 1145, two unrelated families in Winchester celebrated the births of boys they both named William. These two grew up as eerie mirror images. They shared the same shoulder-length hair, married women named Alice, and both had a scar on the cheek from identical jousting accidents. Years later, on the same morning, both men went hunting in different forests. Each spotted a deer and charged, only to lose control of his weapon and impale himself on his own lance. Both died in the same position on the same day. Norway's royal line suffered a similar stutter. In 1030, King Olaf was killed by an arrow to the throat at the Battle of Stiklestad. 2 centuries later, King Olaf IV rode into the same valley on the same calendar date to fight. He was struck by an arrow in the exact same spot on his neck, ending his life in the same manner as his ancestor. These bizarre repetitions suggested to the medieval mind that they were living in a cruel joke. If unrelated nobles and distant kings followed the same doomed trajectories centuries apart, it implied that humans were playthings of a sarcastic universe, rather than masters of their own lives. Even massive military conflicts seem to run on a loop. Exactly 100 years after the famous Battle of Hastings, where an arrow found King Harold's eye, local lords in Sussex staged a sequel. They fought over a sheep meadow on the same hill where the original battle took place. The commanders were both named William, and the fight ended when one of them took an arrow directly to the eye. This repetition extended to the Battle of Crécy. In 1346, the blind King John of Bohemia tied his horse to his knights and charged into a fog of slaughter. 200 years later, on that same field, a partially blind French commander named Charles de Blois repeated the stunt. He tied his horse to his men, ordered the charge, and met the same result. When history produces these inescapable, cyclical tragedies, it creates the appearance of a world devoid of agency. It frames human experience as a closed loop of pre-written destiny. If fate is a pre-written script, it appears a few individuals accidentally gained access to the early drafts. This chart tracks the work of Tommaso Deodina, a painter in 1350. On the left, he finished a mural of monks wearing bird-beaked masks. 100 years later, the Black Death forced doctors to adopt that exact look, stuffed with the same herbs Tommaso painted a century before. In 1170, a monk named Brother Edmund froze mid-hymn during evening prayers at Canterbury. He whispered to his peers that the archbishop was dead. Minutes later, a sweating messenger burst in to announce that Thomas Becket had just been murdered by the king's knights. The assassination occurred inside these same massive stone walls, but far enough from the choir that hearing the struggle was physically impossible. The church classified these moments as divine revelation. People clung to the hope that if they could read these omens, they could finally predict the script and protect themselves from the next tragedy. In 1356, Londoners looked to these towers at Westminster Abbey as black ravens circled them for hours. After a massive storm that night, the birds vanished, and word arrived the next morning that the heir to the throne, Prince Edward, was dead. This localized omen became a permanent fix in royal policy. By the 1600s, King Charles II was so concerned by the bird's reputation for predicting royal death that he mandated 6 ravens be kept at the Tower of London at all times, a tradition that persists today. But predicting fate doesn't mean controlling it. In 1231, Rhineland monks wrote a manuscript titled On the Protection of Holy Houses, explicitly claiming the library could never burn because God protected it. 3 weeks later, lightning struck twice, burning the entire complex to the ground. The only item recovered was the single page claiming the building was fireproof. Spotting a coincidence or attempting to outsmart fate with ink provides no actual power. True historical agency appears when people respond to tragedy with a sense of purpose the omens can't predict. The most enduring cultural legacies are often left by those who are handed a tragic fate and used it to redefine their role in history. In the 12th century, contracting leprosy was an automatic exile. These men were stripped of their titles and sent to live in the Hospital of St. Lazarus, a place where the world sent people it wanted to forget. These outcasts chose to weaponize their decay. They bound their bandaged hands to sword hilts and rode into battle as the Knights of St. Lazarus. Because they were already dying, they charged with a fearlessness that healthy soldiers couldn't match, turning their perceived curse into a unique form of armor. We see a similar defiance in Viriatus. He was a shepherd in the Iberian highlands, whose birth and geography seemingly fated him to be crushed by the Roman legions. Viriatus used his knowledge of the rocky slopes and thin soil to turn the land into a classroom for guerrilla warfare. He led a resistance of hill folk who utilized every ravine to trap and humiliate Rome's superior numbers for nearly a decade. His resistance forced Rome to acknowledge his people's independence. Today, his name remains an essential lesson in cultural survival, and his image sits as a landmark in modern Portuguese and Spanish towns. The ancient Illyrian tribes lived in a similar state of constant conflict. They were fractured into clans that spent generations locked in cycles of blood feuds across the mountains. To bridge these divisions, the tribes established sacred festivals centered on the horse, an animal they believed carried day-length across the heavens. For a few days each season, rival clans surrendered their weapons to the priests of Medorus. They shared roasted meat, performed mock duels as dance, and watched their champions compete in a landscape where victory was viewed as divine favor. This shared ritual provided a neutral ground that the politics of the mountains couldn't reach. History will always present these eerie symmetries: the repeating lances, the identical arrow wounds, and the cyclical tragedies that make us feel powerless. The record of the past suggests we are more than the coincidences that happen to us. We can find history's meaning in the shepherd who challenged an empire, or the rival tribes who chose a race over a feud. These stories prove that while the universe might throw out repeating patterns, the decision to endure and build something new remains our own. Picture a Norse warrior draped in the skin of a bear. He stands at the edge of a battlefield, his teeth physically tearing into the splintering wood of his own shield, in a state of complete battle-ready ecstasy. Or consider a heavily armored French knight sitting on a warhorse, staring through a narrow visor at a field packed with English archers. He knows the terrain is terrible, and that charging forward is likely a death sentence. Yet because his culture views a strategic retreat as a social catastrophe, he spurs his horse directly into the arrows. In a 17th century European courtroom, a panel of educated men is officially sentencing an elderly woman to execution. Their reasoning is simple. A neighbor's cow died shortly after an argument, and in their world, coincidence is less plausible than a curse. To a modern observer, these moments look like pure madness, but these individuals were responding to the internal mechanics of their own world. Their actions were the logical end results of socio-cultural systems designed to prioritize specific outcomes over individual survival. For a medieval knight, a suicidal charge was often a calculated career move. At 7 years old, noble boys began a decade of indoctrination, where they learned that caution earns mockery, while recklessness earns status. This night factory produced men who feared looking hesitant more than they feared physical injury. Honor functioned as literal social currency. It sits here as the central node of a noble's existence. In this system, your perceived bravery dictated your political alliances, your marriage prospects, and your family's land wealth. Tournament illustrations show this economy in action. Two knights collide violently, while a noble audience watches from above. These events rewarded high-risk behavior with immediate fame, transforming a man's willingness to be trampled by a horse into tangible social power. On the battlefield, this conditioning became a trap. As we pan across the lethal chaos of this medieval skirmish, the physical stakes are clear. Knights rode into impossible situations because the social penalty for staying back was worse than the risk of the lance.
By the time a warrior wore gilded armor like this, his status had outgrown the need for practicality. A dead hero's reputation secured his family's future, whereas a living coward lost his entire network. In that world, the armor was a statement that glory was worth the ultimate price. The Vikings developed their own system for bypassing the survival instinct. The Berserker Rage was a spiritual commitment to Odin, the god of frenzy and sacrifice. Warriors prepared for combat through repetitive rituals, swaying by fires and rhythmic chanting to induce an altered state of consciousness. This was a deliberate effort to disconnect from their human identities before the first axe was swung. They completed this shift by donning the hides of bears and wolves. By taking on the pelt of a predator, the warrior signaled to his community and his enemies that his human hesitation had been replaced by animal instinct. This psychological conditioning allowed the warrior to suppress pain and ignore the self-preservation instinct. He became a high-functioning shock troop, capable of maintaining aggression that would break an ordinary soldier. This state of fury fulfilled the specific requirements of the Viking Age.
Chieftains rewarded warriors who could intimidate rivals and lead charges, making this spiritual transformation a vital part of a warrior's professional success. In other eras, the system was defined by the landscape itself. Pre-Roman Britain was a world of precarious harvests, where a bad winter meant starvation. Survival required every individual to remain tightly bound to the tribe. Tribal raiding made defense a communal necessity. This aerial view of an Iron Age hill fort reveals the scale of the response. Communities invested thousands of hours into carving these deep trenches by hand, prioritizing collective security over individual farm work. Because survival was so fragile, tribes gave immense power to the druids. These figures managed the laws and the spiritual rituals needed to appease a harsh environment, blending practical survival with supernatural authority. Even in this brutal environment, wealth was highly organized. This gold torque represents a hierarchy, where rigid loyalty to the tribe and its rituals was the only logical way to prevent the community from fracturing under pressure. When the environmental anxieties of ancient farmers met the religious certainty of the early modern period, the result was a lethal institutional feedback loop. Sudden crop failures or plagues demanded a cause. Since the idea of random misfortune was unacceptable to a community living on the edge, the neighbor with an unpopular reputation became a convenient explanation. This chart shows how local gossip was transformed into a state-sponsored hunt. A crop failure leads to an accusation, which is then processed by a legal court that was structured to prioritize a guilty verdict. This created a self-sustaining cycle. Under intense physical torture, suspects provided the confessions the court demanded. Those confessions were then used as proof that witches were everywhere, justifying the generation of more accusations and more arrests. As the system expanded, social trust eroded. In a village gripped by this logic, accusing a neighbor was often the most effective way to protect your own family from becoming the next target. The witch hunts were an institutional machine, where participating in the collective panic was a survival strategy. Once the courts accepted these rules, mass paranoia became a tactical necessity for the individual. These extreme systems collapsed only when they violently collided with new realities that made their core assumptions unworkable. Chivalry died when individual glory met the mathematics of gunpowder. A cannonball could destroy the castle walls of a noble who spent decades training for a duel, proving that bravery was no longer a match for industrial-scale warfare. The witch trials faded as the scientific revolution began. When courts began to require physical evidence rather than spectral rumors, the internal logic of the hunts could no longer hold up under the weight of empirical scrutiny. History suggests that what we call common sense is often just the set of rules our environment requires us to follow. We look back at these extremes from the safety of our own world, and world that is currently defining what we consider to be obvious. History is a mirror, reminding us that we are all shaped by the systems we live inside. On a blisteringly hot morning in July of 1518, a woman named Frau Troffea stepped into a street in Strasbourg and began to dance. She wasn't celebrating a festival or a wedding. She simply started moving rhythmically and relentlessly, her face dripping with sweat and her body jerking with an unnatural energy. Neighbors watched in confusion, but the episode didn't end. By the end of the week, dozens had joined her. They spun and leaped without music, trapped in motion until their feet blistered, they collapsed from exhaustion, or their hearts gave out. We often view history as a series of quiet paintings and aesthetic eras. However, the medieval past functioned like a merciless pressure cooker. Daily existence was defined by frequent famine, freezing temperatures, and constant violence. These bizarre historical behaviors, like an entire town dancing to its death, revealed the extreme psychological adaptations triggered by that environment. When the pressure is high enough, human hardware rewires itself to handle the load. For populations pushed to the absolute brink, simple survival mechanisms fail. Instead, they reach a point where they must either find a radical way to adapt or suffer a total system break. Consider the lethal physical environment of 9th century Scandinavia. Surviving a Viking winter meant enduring isolated settlements and the persistent threat of an enemy clan launching a raid while the village slept. Like much of pre-industrial Europe, Vikings followed a biphasic sleep cycle, beginning their first sleep after sundown for 4 hours of rest. Around midnight, they woke for a practical interval, stoking fires, checking livestock, or standing guard, before easing into a second sleep until dawn. Their sleeping arrangements were dictated by tactical readiness. A Viking warrior often slept fully clothed in thick wool, with an axe or sword placed securely under their furs.
To undress was to risk hypothermia, or even worse, wake up defenseless to a sudden spear breaking through the door. This proximity was a life-or-death necessity. The longhouse was a communal hall where humans packed around a central hearth, often sharing the space with cows and sheep to utilize the radiant heat of the animals. For the Norsemen, sleep was a carefully calibrated tactical state. It was a period of resting lightly and suspiciously to ensure they survived until morning. Lethal threats also existed inside the structural cages of Renaissance Italy and medieval Europe. Lucrezia Borgia was a young girl born into a lethal patriarchal web. In the papal court of Rome, her father, Pope Alexander VI, utilized her as a disposable political tool. By age 13, she was being married off to secure military alliances, surrounded by spies and a family that eventually orchestrated the murder of her second husband. She survived the collapse of her family by outliving her reputation and reinventing herself. Behind the fortified walls of the Castello Estense, she transformed into the autonomous Duchess of Ferrara, a patron of the arts who outlasted her name. 3 centuries earlier, Richard the Lionheart was born into the Plantagenet dynasty, an environment that demanded martial supremacy to maintain any claim to power. Richard adapted by becoming a permanent warlord, draining England's wealth to fund the Crusades and massive defensive projects like the cliffside fortress of Chateau Gaillard. This martial focus defined his reign and his legacy. Even his tomb effigy depicts him in full armor, a warrior who spent less than 6 months of his decade-long rule inside his own kingdom. Lucrezia and Richard assessed the mechanics of their worlds and transformed into the exact types of weapons required to hold power. But sometimes the environmental and social pressure is so overwhelming that no adaptation is possible. We see this total failure back in Strasbourg. In 1518, the citizens were trapped by compounding stressors: intense, widespread famine, rampant, deadly disease, and fear of St. Vitus's curse. One biological theory points to ergot, a parasitic fungus that grows on rye and produces toxins chemically similar to LSD. Contaminated grain can quickly trigger intense hallucinations and violent convulsions in anyone who inadvertently eats the tainted food. However, modern scholars often lean toward mass psychogenic illness. This occurs when intense trauma causes the human mind to glitch, manifesting as a collective, uncontrollable reaction. The dancing plague represents a total breakdown of a population that had completely run out of ways to cope with reality.
The Viking warriors' light sleep, the political pivots of the Borgias, and the doomed dancers of Strasbourg are all functions of the same mechanism, the human mind finding an escape valve under pressure. While our surroundings have changed, we operate on the same biological and psychological hardware as they did centuries ago. Modern stressors, digital fear contagion, social instability, and failing institutions apply pressure to that same hardware every day. Human behavior will always adapt when the pressure cooker is sealed. The only question is how our next adaptation will look. For most of recorded history, humans have tried to conquer time through sheer mass. We throw unlimited wealth, brutal labor, and fierce political pride into massive structures, hoping to defy gravity and outlive our own empires. The Greeks even curated a list of civilization's vast ego projects, the 7 wonders of the ancient world. They were heavily marketed, incredibly expensive, and completely doomed. Out of the original 7, only the Great Pyramid of Giza still stands. It survived because it sits in a bone-dry climate and consists of 6 million tons of limestone, simply too heavy for anyone to steal. Every other wonder was entirely deleted. They fell to fire, foreign armies, earthquakes, and simple human negligence. If endless wealth, colossal scale, and the greatest engineering of the ancient world cannot guarantee a civilization's immortality, what actually can? The Lighthouse of Alexandria was the ancient world's brightest creation, standing for centuries before repeated earthquakes cracked its base. Its ruins were unceremoniously dredged from the harbor and stacked into a medieval coastal fortress. The Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, a massive architectural tribute to excess, was burned to the ground by an ancient clout chaser. It was rebuilt, then eventually stripped by looters until only a single column remained in a muddy swamp. The mausoleum at Halicarnassus met an identical end. Earthquakes shattered the towering structure, and crusaders raided its elaborate marble friezes and statues. The surviving stones of this great tomb lost all internal prestige. They were simply hauled away and recycled into cheap building blocks for a castle wall. The ruins of the ancient world prove that stacking heavy stones is an unreliable strategy for eternity. To survive, civilizations had to figure out how to build with something else. Thousands of miles from the Mediterranean, the Maya civilization developed an alternative approach. They built their legacy out of shared ritual. They poured their devotion into the sacred ballgame of Pocatoc. The narrow stone court represented the universe, the rubber ball, the sun. Players faced intense limitations, relying only on hips, knees, and elbows to launch a dense ball through the stone rings above. The stakes were cosmic. Victory or defeat culminated in human blood sacrifice, an offering made to feed the gods and ensure the sun would rise. The physical courts were abandoned and swallowed by the jungle, but the ritual of the game survived the collapse of the Maya cities. In Edo, Japan, the pleasure houses were designed using the exact opposite of monumental stone. They built a legacy by deliberately embracing fragility and fleeting moments. At the center of this world was the geisha and the philosophy of Iki, the absolute mastery of restraint. Power came from subtle charm and suggestion. This entire cultural ecosystem was built from fragile, impermanent materials. It relied on paper walls, recited poetry, and the delicate notes of a shamisen. The physical pleasure districts and the rigid laws of the samurai era were easily swept away by the arrival of steamships and rapid modernization. Despite having zero permanent physical footprint, this philosophy of beauty and restraint outlived the buildings. It permanently shaped Japanese cinema, art, and cultural identity for centuries to come. On the Central Asian steppes, a nomadic empire found a way to reject physical architecture entirely. They thrived while leaving behind no footprint at all. Queen Tamiris led the Massagetei, a fierce society of riders who built no cities, carved no statues, and lived entirely in motion. Her enemy was Cyrus the Great. The Persian king was obsessed with cementing his legacy in earth and stone, constructing a vast empire of monuments. Cyrus attempted to conquer the steppes, betraying Thommaris's son in the process. Thommaris responded by ambushing his veterans, destroying his army, and plunging the dead king's head into a blood-filled skin. She achieved a durability that Cyrus couldn't buy with all his wealth. By forging a legend of vengeance and defiance, her story outlasted the entire Persian Empire. Returning to the scattered rubble of the ancient wonders, a clear pattern emerges. Physical empires eventually learn that even massive monuments have a shelf life. This chart compares the physical lifespans of those ancient stone monuments to intangible cultural ideas. While the Colossus of Rhodes collapsed after just 56 years, the rituals of the Maya, the aesthetic of the geisha, and the legend of Thommaris have remained intact for thousands of years. We forge our truest monuments in the human mind. The rituals of the Maya, the art of the geisha, and the legend of Thommaris prove our greatest legacy consists of what we pass down. A wonder only truly dies when people stop telling its story, making storytelling humanity's most effective survival strategy. We tend to view our concrete cities and digital grids as proof of our total control. We assume humanity sits comfortably at the top of the food chain, holding a tight leash on the natural world. But the birth of civilization was a moment of extreme vulnerability. Agriculture anchored us to a single spot, creating grain stores that attracted disease and territories that required organized, brutal warfare to defend. Our expansion outpaced our own biological capacity to survive. To bridge this gap, humanity didn't conquer nature, we negotiated with it. We survived by entering into silent, nonverbal labor contracts with a few specific species willing to tolerate our presence. Human history is the record of these pacts, which ultimately dictated how far our ancestors could travel, how much they could eat, and who they were able to conquer. The first of these contracts was an accidental occupation. Around 10,000 years ago, our grain stores became all-you-can-eat buffets for rodents, which drew the African wildcat out of the desert and into human camps. The cats arrived to hunt the rats, not to serve the farmers. Over generations, the cats that didn't bolt at the sight of humans secured the best access to food and warmth. They learned that purring and minimal tolerance of humans guaranteed a steady supply of leftovers. They didn't evolve to work for us, they evolved to manage our perception of them. Humans completely misread this calculated distance. We mistook their cold indifference for poise, and granted deep emotional and divine significance to what was essentially an efficient predator. This projection reached its peak in Egypt, where cats became sacred protected entities. Killing one, even by accident, was a capital crime. Feline fanaticism created an entire industry of ritual sacrifice and commercial mummification, resulting in millions of cats being buried with more ceremony than most humans. This trade of pest control for luxury wasn't unique to the Nile. In Asia, farmers entered into a parallel agreement with the Asian leopard cat. It was a different species and a different culture, but the feline strategy of freeloading through proximity remained identical. The contract held until medieval Europe broke it. Spurred by superstition, people purged the cat population, labeling them demonic servants. Without their natural pest control, rat populations surged, carrying the fleas that delivered the Black Death to every corner of the continent. Cats found a way to secure endless resources while contributing the bare minimum. By offering a silent, mystical presence, they induced humans to build temples, draft death sentences for their protection, and spend fortunes on mummification. We provided the physical survival. They provided a blank slate for our own projected emotions. On the Asian steppe, survival doesn't allow for ornamental pets. This is a sea of grass and frost, an environment where any partner must contribute to the immediate arithmetic of staying alive. The Mongol approach was to let the steppe call the herd. They used no barns or stables, letting winter filter out the weak. The horses that survived were integrated into the clan as respected kin, valued for their endurance in the open air. The partnership was intensely physical. Mongol warriors relied on their horses for warmth during blizzards and nourishment during famines. When food was gone, a rider could open a small vein in his mount's neck to drink enough blood to survive the day, sealing the wound and riding on. This bond created a massive military advantage. By traveling with a rotating cluster of multiple mounts, a single warrior could cover over 100 kilometers in a day. They outpaced every settled army because their horses grazed on the move, never requiring stationary supply lines. The Mongols conquered their empire because they never attempted to dominate the horse. They treated the animal as an equal partner in endurance, and in return, the horse carried them across the known world. In ancient Macedon, noble sons were sent to the palace to master the horse. These teenagers lived in the royal courtyards, learning to handle high-strung mounts long before they were ever taught the nuances of state diplomacy. These riders became the hetairoi, or the companions. They were conditioned to view their mounts and their king with the same absolute loyalty. To serve in the companion cavalry was to enter a brotherhood where the safety of the monarch was the only measurable success. This loyalty manifested in the cavalry wedge. This formation concentrated the kinetic force of hundreds of horses into a single point, intended to shatter enemy lines. It functioned only because every rider and every horse moved with the synchronized trust of a single organism. This unity was mirrored in the banquet hall, where the king sat among his cavalrymen to blur the lines of royal hierarchy. They drank and swore oaths as equals, reinforcing the intimacy required to trust one another in a headlong charge. Under Alexander the Great, these bonds were sealed in blood and wine. Sacrificial rituals and shared danger turned these men and beasts into an intertwined mass of discipline. They didn't just fight for a king, they fought for the man and the horse riding beside them. The hetairoi took the trust required to ride into a spear wall and used that same bond to cement the political loyalty needed to govern an empire. When Alexander died, his empire broke apart, but the model of the pack-bonded military brotherhood lived on. The cavalry elite he helped create influenced military structures for the next 2,000 years. We can still see these legacies today. The Mongol horse remains a wild, resilient force on the steppe, while the domestic cat continues to enjoy a life of total luxury in our homes, fueled by a contract signed 10 millennia ago. Human history was never a solo achievement. Our greatest triumphs were co-authored narratives, built on the physical endurance and psychological manipulation of the animals we partnered with. Evolution's greatest trick was allowing humans to believe we domesticated the natural world. In reality, the natural world simply evaluated the terms of our survival and negotiated a seat at the table. Walk through a pre-modern city. Whether it's the sprawl of ancient Rome or the wooden alleys of medieval Europe, and the air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, sweat, and open sewage. Daily life in these streets was a physical struggle for survival. For the ruling elite, this concentration of humanity represented a constant existential threat. With thousands of commoners for every one aristocrat, a single bad harvest or a spike in the price of grain could trigger a riot capable of tearing down the ruling class in a single afternoon. While city guards could suppress a mob, rulers couldn't rely on swords alone to maintain their position. To keep the empire from fracturing, they needed to engineer obedience through more subtle means, designing a society where architecture and pageantry did the work of the legion. This engineered order relied on three distinct pillars: grand, visceral entertainment, carefully cultivated political imagery, and strict monopolistic control over how a person could earn a living. These institutions functioned as social technologies. They were designed to enforce hierarchies and secure the loyalty of the masses, ensuring the people at the bottom remained invested in the system that kept them there. Step out of the dark tunnels and into the glaring sun of the Roman Colosseum. The individual is instantly swallowed by the roar of 50,000 citizens and the smell of blood staining the sand. It is an instrument of state control, designed to overwhelm the senses. The Colosseum seating operated as a physical map of the Roman caste system. Senators occupied cushioned benches at the bottom, while the uppermost tiers, hot, crowded, and furthest from view, were reserved for women, slaves, and the poor. This mosaic captures the morning warm-up, the beast hunts. By importing and slaughtering panthers, elephants, and lions from conquered lands, Rome provided a visceral demonstration of its global dominance to every citizen in the stands. The gladiatorial combat followed this same logic of categorization. As seen in this relief, fighters were paired by specific armor and weaponry, like the heavy secutor against the light net-wielding radiarius, turning a blood sport into a demonstration of martial order. Rome built this behemoth to send a message to its subjects. The empire was capable of killing with beauty, efficiency, and absolute authority. While the arena controlled the people through spectacle, the rulers faced the challenge of projecting a stable image to prevent the empire from fracturing from within. Imperial governance required a constant public performance of strength. Empress Faustina the Younger occupied the center of this performance. Her public image was meticulously crafted to embody both maternal virtue and imperial poise, as seen in this serene marble portrait. Faustina took the performance of power directly to the frontiers. She traveled with Marcus Aurelius during military campaigns, living among the legions to maintain morale, and earning the unprecedented title Mother of the Camp. This visibility drew intense scrutiny from traditionalists in the Senate. A woman wielding such public influence challenged the Roman patriarchal order, and her presence in the military camps was viewed by some as an improper encroachment on male power. Her enemies weaponized rumors of infidelity and political scheming against her. Years later, critics used her as a convenient scapegoat for the erratic, cruel reign of her son, Emperor Commodus, claiming his madness was the result of her supposed secret life. For the Roman elite, governance was a high-stakes spectacle. A public image meant immense power, but remained a vulnerability that enemies could easily rewrite. Centuries after Rome's fall, the medieval marketplace emerged as a chaotic, unregulated environment. Without central oversight, the quality of goods was erratic, and the economy was prone to instability. Medieval guilds formed to impose order on this chaos. They regulated every aspect of trade, from raw material quality to final prices, effectively establishing an economic hierarchy that controlled who was allowed to prosper in the city. The guilds enforced a grueling pipeline. A boy started as an abused apprentice, then became a traveling journeyman. The final jump to master required a masterpiece, a severe bottleneck allowing elders to decide who could join the ruling economic class. While guilds provided a safety net for their members, they frequently operated as exclusionary, hereditary cartels. By setting impossible standards or favoring their own children, they locked outsiders out of economic mobility and maintained a monopoly on local labor. The rhythm of medieval life was dictated by the church's liturgical calendar. This schedule swung the populace through a relentless cycle of holy days, rituals, and strict periods of discipline. This discipline reached its peak during Lent, 40 days of mandatory fasting. Meat, dairy, and eggs were stripped from the diet, creating a period of physical hunger and psychological tension that gripped the entire community. This manuscript shows the result of that tension, the feast. Holiday celebrations like Easter and Epiphany were designed as explosive releases. As the musicians played and tables groaned under forbidden meats, the strict rules of the fast were swept away in a burst of indulgence. These feasts were immersive theaters. Actors known as mummers performed absurd plays, while kings for a day, often chosen by finding a bean in a cake, were given temporary license to give ridiculous orders to their social superiors. This engineered cycle of deprivation, followed by sanctioned chaos, acted as a vital pressure valve. By giving the lower classes a brief, controlled taste of freedom, the system prevented the pressures of everyday life from erupting into genuine rebellion. The Colosseum eventually fell to ruin, and the medieval guilds were outpaced by the Industrial Revolution. However, the logic underpinning these systems of control remained. We see their descendants in trade certifications that guard career entry, in the meticulously staged PR campaigns of our politicians, and in the massive, commercialized spectacles that still define our holiday seasons. Whether we are sitting in an ancient arena or a modern city, we are still living within engineered systems of order. The architecture has evolved, but we are still participating in the spectacle.
We tend to view fashion as a tool for self-expression, but that idea is shattered by the ancient reality. For centuries, your clothes and your posture were highly regulated tools of the state. Nowhere was this more visible than at a Roman villa party. While it looks like a wine-soaked free-for-all to us, it was actually a high-stakes diplomatic arena where every movement was scrutinized by your peers. The toga was the uniform of this performance. Its heavy folds required a rigid, specific posture just to keep the fabric from unraveling, forcing the wearer into a physical display of discipline and status. In this environment, a misplaced glance or a spilled drink didn't lead to a prison cell. It led to the total erasure of your social and political future. This pressure was maintained by an invisible infrastructure. Enslaved workers moved silently through the room, pouring wine while mentally cataloging every guest's flaw and whispered deal. The outcomes of Senate debates were often decided here first. Civic laws and military movements were negotiated on dining couches, where the casual setting masked the severity of the deal-making. Your position determined your safety. Guests in the danger zones near the wine were liabilities, while those in power zones near the host drove decision-making. Strategic curtains manipulated the space, hiding secret negotiations behind the curtains in a crowded room. The Roman elite thrived on this constant surveillance, forcing every guest to police their own body to survive the political circuit. As we move into medieval England, social pressure shifted into literal law. The state decided that social hierarchy must be visually unmistakable and legally enforceable. These were the sumptuary laws. They were royal decrees that dictated which materials, dyes, and garments a person was permitted to wear based strictly on their birth rank. The crown literally policed the width of sleeves and the use of expensive dyes to ensure that a successful merchant could never be visually confused with a member of the nobility. Religious authorities enforced these codes alongside the state. They used the wimple to wrap and hide a woman's hair, turning a simple physical trait into a sign of religious submission. In this era, your clothes were your legal identity. Dressing outside your assigned class was a prosecutable crime, punishable by heavy fines. To maintain their status, the nobility adopted trends that were so impractical they functioned as proof that the wearer did not perform physical labor. They wore palanes, shoes with points so long they required whalebone stuffing just to remain upright. You couldn't work or fight in these. They existed to broadcast that the wearer was exempt from survival tasks. The codpiece followed this logic into warfare, where anatomical exaggeration was forged into steel to project raw, aggressive dominance during military parades and tournaments. Discomfort was a tool of hard power. The elite transformed the physical body into a walking legal boundary, proving through their restrictive clothing that they occupied the top of the social order. But in ancient Egypt, the stakes for presentation moved beyond the law of kings and into the law of the gods. To the Egyptians, beauty was a theological requirement. Symmetrical features and meticulous grooming were mandatory spiritual practices to align the human body with divine perfection. Kohl eyeliner was the primary tool for this. While it reduced the glare of the sun, it also acted as spiritual armor, meant to ward off malevolent curses. Cleanliness was a prerequisite for holiness. This required shaving the head entirely to wear elaborate wigs and melting perfumed wax cones that scented the body throughout the day. This divine dress code extended into the afterlife. Mummification was designed to ensure that the deceased appeared before the gods in a state of eternal, anointed radiance. These rituals transformed grooming into a religious necessity. To pass the final judgment of the gods, you had to arrive looking as symmetrical and clean as the deities themselves. The most restrictive version of this control brings us back to Rome and the Vestal Virgins. These women were chosen as children and bound to a lifetime of state-mandated ritual on a very public stage. A vestal held rights no other Roman woman could claim: property ownership and the power to pardon prisoners. But this status depended entirely on her physical and reputational purity. Rome believed that the city's eternal flame inside this temple was fueled by the priestess's devotion. If her purity was questioned, the safety of the entire empire was considered at risk. If a Vestal was even rumored to have broken her vow, the state protected its sacred contract through a slow, silent execution. Because her blood could not be spilled, she was led to a dark underground chamber and buried alive. For thousands of years, the state, the law, and the gods claimed ownership of the human form. The ability to treat your own appearance as a personal choice is a recent, radical departure from the ways we once survived.
In 1377, Cardinal Robert of Geneva marched into the town of Cesena and slaughtered thousands of civilians in a single weekend. The church rewarded him with a promotion to anti-pope. 2 centuries later, a German bandit named Christmann Gennepertanga was caught after killing nearly 1,000 travelers. For his crimes, his limbs were broken with an axe before he was decapitated and burned. The Middle Ages were saturated in violence, but the act of killing was not universally condemned. In a world where death was a constant neighbor, the moral weight of a crime didn't rest on the body count. It rested on the status of the person holding the blade. Mapping these crimes reveals a rigid social framework. Violence occupied 3 tiers. At the top sat sanctioned warfare, framed as a holy necessity. In the middle were the shadow networks of those lacking legal power. At the bottom was the violence that didn't serve a political purpose, the kind that society explained away through folklore and demons. In a medieval courtroom, the weight of the evidence was often secondary to the weight of a title. Justice functioned as a mechanism to preserve rank. Guilt or innocence was effectively a product of who controlled the narrative. Sanctioned violence occupied the highest ground. When mass killing served the interests of the state or the church, it was mythologized as heroic and spiritually cleansing. This manuscript illustrates how the church documented and glorified holy warfare. During the Crusades, the brutal march to Jerusalem was framed as the highest form of devotion. Through the mechanism of indulgences, the Pope offered knights a full remission of sins, transforming the bloodshed of the battlefield into an act of divine penance. Even great enemies could be granted this noble status. This portrait of Saladin emphasizes a regal dignity that stood in contrast to the era's typical demonization of rivals. Because his violence was state-led and disciplined, chroniclers viewed his clashes with the West through a lens of chivalry rather than common murder. Eleanor of Aquitaine utilized this sanctioned power to bypass the limitations of her gender. She was more than a consort. She was a ruler who joined the Second Crusade and later coordinated a massive family rebellion against King Henry II. Her tomb effigy shows her holding an open book, a testament to her role as an intellectual and political force. Eleanor raised the ransoms that bankrupted kingdoms and funded the wars that preserved the Angevin dynasty. Because her actions served the expansion of the ruling elite, her violence was documented as leadership, not crime. At this level of the social ladder, massive bloodshed is frequently rewarded. It becomes the foundation of history because it secures the power of the few who write it. Below this sanctioned elite sat the middle tier, violence utilized by those with no seat at the table. These were crimes born in the shadows, engineered by people with no traditional legal recourse. Beatrice Cenci remains the face of this middle tier. Her father was a documented monster whose violence was ignored by the state and the Pope alike. After years of abuse, Beatrice and her family drugged him and bludgeoned him to death. The state saw a murder. The people saw a martyr who had done what the courts refused to do. In Naples and Rome, Giulia Tofana operated a similar shadow network. She produced aqua tofana, a colorless, tasteless poison marketed as facial lotion. It provided an underground divorce system for women trapped in dangerous marriages, allowing them to edit their lives when the law would not. The state strictly criminalized these acts because they challenged patriarchal control and social stability. While the public often celebrated these killers as necessary agents of survival, the law punished them to ensure that justice remained a top-down privilege. At the base of the hierarchy was unsanctioned chaotic violence. These were killings that provided no political gain and offered no sympathetic justification. When faced with repeat killers who defied social norms, medieval authorities often turned to the supernatural to categorize the behavior. Without a modern clinical framework for these crimes, folklore provided a way to explain the unfathomable. When evidence of cannibalism was found in a tailor shop in Chalons, or when Peter Stump confessed to butchering children near Cologne, society didn't see a human outlier. They saw a demonic pact. Stump was executed not just as a murderer, but as a werewolf who had traded his soul for a magical belt. Even heroes could be recategorized. Gilles de Rais, a knight and companion to Joan of Arc, was initially a golden boy of the French court, but as his private atrocities came to light, he was stripped of his rank and branded a monster. His fall shows how quickly the state could move a person from the top of the hierarchy to the bottom. These monstrous labels were also weaponized to silence the powerful. Witchcraft accusations against Elizabeth Bathory and Alice Keiteler allowed men to seize their lands and dissolve their influence. By defining these women as unholy, the state removed them from the protection of the social order entirely. Branding a killer as a supernatural monster stripped away their humanity and explained away systemic failures. It ensured that their violence was seen as a demonic intrusion, rather than a human reality the state had failed to manage. Across this entire spectrum, from holy crusades to poisoners' dens, the physical act of killing remained the same. Life was taken by force. Medieval justice was rarely a search for objective morality. It was a tool used to defend a social hierarchy. The law didn't care that blood was spilled. It cared about whose blood it was and whose hand was on the hilt. This dynamic survives in the way we still frame power. The stories that decide who is a hero and who is a monster are rarely objective. They are authored by those with the systemic influence to make their version of the truth stick. Long after the swords were sheathed and the poisons were poured, the propaganda and folklore remained the mechanisms that decided whose life mattered. In the Middle Ages, the narrative was always more powerful than the crime.
Modern life is pretty low stakes. You pet your cat, you make a cup of coffee, you throw on a jacket, and you go about your day. None of these actions carry hidden weight. But step back a few centuries into a dimly lit room like this, and you enter a reality where the concept of a mundane, meaningless object simply did not exist. In pre-modern societies, the physical world was a direct reflection of the spiritual one. Everyday objects and casual habits were interpreted as tangible evidence of unseen forces, whether that was a divine blessing, state authority, or a pact with the devil. Because everything carried symbolic weight, your daily routine was constantly under surveillance. A misunderstood gesture or a strange habit carried the power of life and death, capable of elevating you to power or sending you to the executioner. To see how this worked, we are going to trace the hidden power of ordinary things across 4 distinct historical landscapes. From the paranoia of a medieval village to the stone fortresses of crusading knights, the bustling social hubs of Ottoman Istanbul, and the battlefields of feudal Japan. Imagine living in a medieval European village where life is completely quiet. No traffic, no background hum. In this silence, if you muttered to yourself while feeding your chickens, your neighbors assumed you were whispering incantations. If you let a stray cat curl up in your lap, you were obviously holding a strategy meeting with an infernal advisor. Practical knowledge was highly suspicious. Medieval medicine relied heavily on prayer and bloodletting. If a village healer could quickly soothe a cough using a peppermint infusion or a chamomile salve, her success was terrifying. To the local authorities, highly effective medicine proved she had made a dark, unnatural pact.
This illustration shows how medieval minds viewed the natural world. Look at the root system, drawn as a bleeding dragon. Because of this, owning an herbal guide was incredibly dangerous. To an interrogator, a simple book of plants functioned as a literal spellbook. The scrutiny extended to the human body itself. A dark mole was interpreted as a witch's mark, a contract signed in flesh by Satan. Even picking up a cup with your left hand was perilous. Because right-handedness was associated with divine order, the left hand represented chaos, deception, and the dark arts. In this environment, survival required constant vigilance over your own body and habits. You could not simply exist. Any stray word, unusual object, or physical quirk could be instantly misread as an allegiance to the unseen forces of evil. Moving to the medieval Middle East, we find a different kind of manifestation. During the Crusades, groups of ordinary men took strict, abstract monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They translated those spiritual promises directly into physical weapons of war.
Joining orders like the Templars or Hospitallers meant surrendering all personal wealth in exchange for a stark uniform. A simple white or black mantle, marked with a bold cross, acted as undeniable physical proof of their divine, martial sanction, turning them into steel-clad monks fighting for the salvation of souls. To project this unseen divine authority over hostile landscapes, they built massive architectural strongholds. This is Crac de Chevalier in modern-day Syria. With its towering concentric stone walls and deep moats, it allowed a small group of disciplined knights to project physical dominance and survive brutal sieges. This militarized faith eventually expanded far beyond the Levant. This is Malbork Castle in modern Poland, built by the Teutonic Knights. Operating in the Baltic, they used massive brick fortresses like this to colonize new territories, conquer pagan tribes, and monopolize regional trade.
Through their clothing, discipline, and stone fortresses, these knights successfully turned the invisible will of God into the most formidable geopolitical institutions of their time. By the mid-16th century, a strange new beverage arrived in Ottoman Istanbul. Brewed in a traditional copper pot over glowing embers, coffee was bitter, earthy, and unlike anything else in the capital. It awakened the mind while keeping the body alert, carving out a unique space in a city where wine was forbidden. The drink necessitated a new kind of gathering space. Inside the coffee house, rigid physical boundaries dissolved. For the price of a single cup, a wealthy silk merchant, a seasoned janissary, and a traveling poet could sit shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches, sharing backgammon boards and engaging in spirited debates. To understand why these spaces became fixtures in the urban landscape, look at this vintage photograph of a waterside Turkish coffee house.
Before this, public gathering spaces were strictly tied to the mosque, the marketplace, or the bathhouse. The coffee house offered a rare, neutral ground for ordinary citizens to mingle freely outside the official hierarchy. This openness terrified the authorities. Sultans weren't afraid of the roasted beans. They were afraid of the unseen forces the coffee house incubated. A shadow puppet show could carry sharp political satire. Rumors from the palace spread faster here than official decrees. It was the perfect breeding ground for unauthorized news and political dissent. Rulers even tried banning the drink under the guise of public morality, but the resilient coffee culture survived in the shadows. A simple porcelain cup of coffee had become a vessel for social leveling, transforming a daily habit into a political liability for the empire's established hierarchy. In feudal Japan, warfare required a physical transformation that was deeply spiritual. Looking at these armored samurai, their equipment, known as yoroi, acted as a spiritual bridge between the physical world and unseen forces of fate and loyalty. Donning the armor was a deliberate ritual. Assistants tied intricate knots of silk cord and layered heavy lacquered plates over the warrior's body. The samurai entered a disciplined state of readiness. Every tightened cord physically bound the warrior to their clan's history, anchoring their mind for the life-or-death struggle ahead.
This is the kabuto, the helmet that served as the crowning piece of the armor. The ornate floral patterns and the prominent gold clan crest, or mon, made the armor a portable biography and a spiritual talisman, instantly communicating the wearer's lineage and virtues to both allies and enemies. Lowering the helmet onto the head was the final step in this transformation. Encased in lacquered plates and silk cords, the samurai stood as a physical representative of his clan, carrying centuries of ancestral honor onto the battlefield. The massive stone fortresses of the Crusades eventually fell. The extreme paranoia of the witch trials faded into myth, and the samurai's armor was eventually replaced by gunpowder. But the underlying human psychology that drove these societies never actually went away. Even today, we constantly use the physical world to broadcast our invisible internal lives. The brands on our clothing, the specific aesthetic of the coffee shops we choose to sit in, and our daily consumer habits all serve to telegraph our identities, our political leanings, and our values to everyone around us. We are inherently symbolic creatures. From the coffee in our cups to the clothes on our backs, we are driven to turn the mundane objects of our lives into a visible language of status, identity, and belief.
Before taxes and tolls dictated daily life, medieval peasants relied on communal lifelines. You drank from the river, gathered fallen branches for heat, and brought your dough to the village oven. The natural world was a freely accessible grid, perfectly suited for people with zero money and zero rights. The logic of enclosure changed the purpose of the landscape. Resources that once provided shared survival were suddenly treated as assets to be boxed in and managed for profit. As this animation shows, the once open grid of trees, water, and grain is carved up by rigid borders. A central authority locks the gates, turning the earth itself into a subscription service. The reach of these claims was total. Nobles charged tolls for wading across shallow streams. They declared that all fallen sticks belonged to the crown, requiring peasants to buy permits to collect firewood. One lord even attempted to tax the rainwater falling on his estate, making it technically a crime to let moisture hit your face without paying the collector. To ensure people actually paid these fees, lords engineered a triple tax trap. This diagram highlights the three primary gates: the mill, the oven, and the brewery. By outlawing hand mills and private ovens, the nobility forced every family into a state of total economic dependency. If you wanted to eat or drink safely, you had to use the lord's infrastructure and pay the mandated fee. When survival is criminalized, ordinary people become ninjas. Peasants sneaked into forests at night to gather wood, and whole neighborhoods developed secret signals to warn each other when ale inspectors were approaching. This wasn't rebellion for its own sake. It was the only way to bypass a system that charged a fee for the right to exist. Simply claiming ownership of nature isn't enough to sustain power. When people inevitably resist these rules, the opportunistic claim must evolve. To keep the gates locked over the long term, an enclosure must be backed by violent, systematic enforcement. That evolution is visible in the deployment of the Roman military. When the province of Judea revolted against imperial taxation, Rome sent Legio X Fretensis, a hardened legion shaped by naval warfare and civil conflict. They weren't there to negotiate a new tax rate. They were sent to re-establish an absolute monopoly on authority. The physical challenge at Jerusalem was defined by masonry. The Second Temple stood behind the massive, sheer outer walls seen here. The Roman strategy relied on total encirclement, building a wall of circumvallation around the city, turning it into a claustrophobic cage. Once the walls failed, the 10th Legion dismantled the city's heart. They burned the temple and established a permanent garrison on the ruins. By building barracks and checkpoints over the remains of the old capital, they completely erased local identity and ensured that any future resistance would face an immediate, localized military response. Absolute force can break a rebellion, but it is too expensive to maintain as a permanent solution. For control to survive the centuries,
It has to move away from the sword and into the more efficient, normalized machinery of bureaucracy. By the 12th century, power had transitioned from the battlefield into the marketplace. As trade grew, craftsmen began forming sworn associations called guilds. These groups moved the center of systemic control from military garrisons to urban centers. These guilds operated as effective cartels. This flowchart maps the strict pipeline to practice a trade. An apprentice endured years of unpaid labor to become a journeyman. These bottlenecks ensured only a few masters reached the top to eliminate outside competition.
Guilds used their self-made laws to crush anyone working outside the system. They ruthlessly raided unlicensed workshops, seized valuable tools, and explicitly barred women and migrants from holding economic power. This wasn't about a lack of skill. It was about ensuring that only members of the guild brotherhood could profit from the town's expanding markets. The system succeeded because it rebranded a monopoly as quality control. Guilds convinced the public that their rigid rules were necessary for urban stability and consumer safety. People accepted the lack of choice because they believed the guild's seal was their only protection against fraud. Institutional monopolies are the most durable form of power because they are written into the laws of the city. But the more rigid a system becomes, the more vulnerable it is to someone who understands the rules well enough to hack them. The Ottoman imperial harem was an enclosed society managed behind the guarded gates of Topkapi Palace. Every structured space was designed to isolate the dynasty. This strict isolation prevented any outside influence from interfering with the imperial line of succession. Hurrem Sultan arrived at this palace as an enslaved captive at the absolute bottom of the hierarchy. She was a foreign prisoner in a world that expected her to be silent and invisible. Her strategy was to master the harem's internal logic rather than fighting it. She recognized that the Sultan's attention was the system's only real power source. By engaging Suleiman as an intellectual equal, she created a personal monopoly on his affections that made her indispensable to the state. From that position, she dismantled Ottoman traditions. She secured a legal marriage, an act unheard of for a concubine, and neutralized rival heirs to protect her own children. She built a political network that bypassed traditional palace hierarchies, effectively running the empire's internal diplomacy from within the harem walls. She solidified this power by stepping into the public eye. The massive stone domes of the Haseki complex represent her transition to a public pillar. Through these charitable institutions, she earned a level of legitimacy that ancient palace protocols could no longer deny. The ultimate expression of power isn't just building a monopoly. It's understanding the architecture of an existing system so perfectly that you can hijack it to serve your own ends. The progression from the medieval forest to the Ottoman court reveals a persistent pattern. An opportunistic claim is backed by violence, normalized by bureaucratic rules, and eventually cracked open by strategic subversion. This pattern remains the primary logic of the modern digital era. The lords who charged for rainwater have been replaced by corporations enclosing the internet. We see the same enclosure in subscription models and paywalls that turn once open digital spaces into a series of private toll roads. Skeptical. We see the same gatekeeping in modern political lobbying and corporate cartels. By establishing mandatory certifications and complex legal barriers, these groups protect their dominance and stifle innovation, functioning with the same exclusionary logic that once governed the medieval guild halls. While the tools have changed, the foundational blueprint for controlling and monetizing human behavior has remained consistent for nearly a millennium. Systemic control is the operating system of civilization. From fish in a medieval river to data on your smartphone, everything was free until someone figured out how to lock the gate and charge for it, and we have been paying the toll ever since.